Trying to figure out what finish to use on your metal? I'll introduce you to a couple that I like using. Hi, it's James, and I'm here to talk about different finishes that you can use on your metal. Finishing is really kind of a personal choice as long as it's looking clearly intentional. And I have some other videos that I've gone over with some other that have included some finishing or have talked about texturing and things like that. So in here I was just going to go over a couple of the techniques that I really like for final finishing on materials. And we just have a scrap piece of aluminum to kind of demonstrate some of those. One that I really like, particularly for edges or little details, is called burnishing, and you might have seen me do this in some other videos. And what burnishing is just using a curved piece of polished tool steel set in a handle, so this is a burnisher, and what it does is as you rub it on the metal, it imparts that polished surface of the steel onto the metal. So what I typically use this for is any kind of like raised details or edges, so you get this nice little glint. So what I'm going to do is demonstrating on the aluminum that's just a sheared edge, but then going in with a burnisher, and you can go back and forth, and it'll literally sort of smooth down that edge. And hopefully you can see in the video there that just little bit of a glint that you get there from rubbing that polished steel on the corner of the metal. And I think that it's just a really sweet little detail on a piece that as people are really appreciating your work and looking at the fine details, they can pick up on that. So that's not just for edge treatments, but that's honestly where I use it the most. It's also a tool that's used a lot in stone setting with bezels around stones and things like that. So very versatile tool to have in your toolbox. Another finish that I really like, since I'm not doing a ton of tiny shiny things, is just using a brass brush. And you can use this either directionally, so it all goes in one direction and has kind of a grain to it, or you can even use it to just almost kind of mat the surface of it and going around in small circles. So several different approaches, and it's going to be very different based on the metal that you're working with or the type of finish that you have. And you can see a little bit of a difference that directional tends to have more of a shine to it, and that sort of circular approach has a little bit of more of a matte finish. You can also do this with a little bit of soap underwater, and that will also give a really nice uniform finish on a piece as well, and that's something that I'll do quite commonly. So that's another really great tool, and I'll have different brass brushes for different materials and different pieces that I'm working with. So that's another really great addition to invest in. And so since I'm not doing a lot of super fine finishes on high-end jewelry, I use a sunshine cloth that Rio Grande sells. It has a very mild abrasive in it, but does get a very quick polish that's good enough for most of the things that I'm using it for. It can also remove a little bit of tarnish that might be on your piece. So again, it's just like a polishing cloth that has a mild abrasive in it, and I tend to use it in sort of small circular movements, just so I don't get any kind of directional lines in it. And hopefully you can see in the video, it's subtle in this case, where this is just the factory finish, and then there's just a slight polishing to it with the sunshine cloth right there. So those are kind of the three ways that I'll use to do some final finishes on the piece. And then there's the other question, particularly when you're working with materials that are going to tarnish in some way. So not aluminum, but brass, bronze, copper, silver, things like that. There's two ways that I will seal the piece to prevent either tarnish from occurring, or if you have a nice patina on a piece, to maintain that patina with the piece. So one of them is an archival wax that's used by museums, and it's called Renaissance wax, and you might have seen it in catalogs. And yes, for the price of wax, it is really expensive, but it's well worth having. A little bit goes a very long way, and you just follow the directions on the can, and it's just a really excellent quality wax where you can just get a little bit of it, and I'll just use on our same aluminum piece right now, but you can just slightly rub a little bit onto the surface. Now it is going to look like it's dulling the metal a little bit, and you want to let it sort of set up, and so it'll sort of dry on that surface a little bit, and then you can get a clean rag and burnish that back off. Just for the sake of the video, I'll go for it right here. And it doesn't, again, it's not a polishing cloth, so it won't change the final finish of the metal, but it'll just slightly protect it. Some people don't like waxing their pieces because with jewelry it can rub off eventually, but for let's say a vessel or something that you have a nice patina on and that you want to preserve it, it works really wonderfully, and it'll just seal that surface so it's not changing. Again, not something that we need to worry about so much on aluminum, but it's just a really great thing to have in your studio and invest in. So and it lasts a very, very long time. As you can see, I've had this jar for a long time. If you have a piece that has a lot of texture, or you can't really rub a wax onto it or rub a wax back off, this Nicholas clear lacquer was recommended to me by instrument makers. So you think of like brass instruments and things like that, where they need to have a lacquered finish on the piece to preserve it so it's nice and shiny and everything else. And they have different finishes of this lacquer, so a higher gloss versus a less gloss finish and everything else. But I find this to really be very durable, work really well, doesn't tend to run quite as easily or really glom on the surface or something like that. So it is a big difference between a more readily available, cheaper spray lacquer that you could get at a craft store or hardware store. And this is another thing that I'd really recommend investing in, and a little bit goes a very long way. I'm not going to spray any lacquer right now because that's a whole other setup and everything, but again, it's ideal to work with a ventilated spray booth when you're doing that, making sure that every area is covered for overspray, and take your time with your piece, let it fully dry. Don't rush it and get some drips and really sort of ruin your piece at the last minute. But this is my favorite go-to lacquer that I recommend if you have a piece that can't be waxed. So just kind of collected a couple different approaches that I like to use when I'm finishing up with a piece, and have some different techniques or materials that I'll use to just preserve that final finish or give some nice little details to the end. So hope this is useful to you. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.